This PowerPoint goes with Lesson 4 of New Testament Greek, A Whole Language Approach by R.D. Kunjummen. I'm Laura Hunt, and I work at Michigan Theological Seminary. This lesson is on Greek accents. Greek accents are different from breathing marks. We've seen breathing marks before. They're considered part of the spelling, and they only occur on the first letter of a word, and only when that's a vowel or a row. They tell us whether to put an H sound at the beginning of the word, so whether to pronounce the word with a H at the beginning or not. They're considered part of the spelling. Now accents are different. Accents are straight, whereas breathing marks are curved, except of course for the circumflex accent, which we'll see in a little bit. They're not considered part of the spelling, but they are sometimes very important for distinguishing between words. What we'll see is that there are some words that look identical except for the Greek accents, and so in that case it'll be important to recognize the accent. And in addition, accents can sometimes give you clues about what's going on with a verb form. The earliest text to have accents is dated in the 6th century, but they are in our printed Greek text, and so it's helpful to know what it is that's going on with them. Now when we talk about accents, we need to talk about syllables as well, and there are 3 syllables that are important when we talk about accents, and those are the last 3. And so those last 3 syllables have specific vocabulary, specific words that we use to identify them. So that's the first thing we're going to look at. The very last syllable on a word is called the ultima. So in the word eskatos, the ultima is the tos syllable. And in the word agathos, the ultima is the thos syllable. The next to last syllable is called the penult. So in these same 2 words, we have eskatos, and now we have the cha, which is the penult, and again the tos was the ultima. And agathos, the ga is the penult, and the thos is the ultima still, of course. The third syllable from the end is called the antepenult. The antepenult in our word eskatos is that first syllable in this particular word, the s. The cha, of course, is the penult, and the tos is the ultima. Now, in a longer word, the antepenult isn't necessarily going to be the first syllable. Pantokrator, the to is the antepenult, the kra is the penult, and the tor is the ultima. And then you can have an even longer word like ginosketosan. The ke now is the antepenult, the to is the penult, and the son is the ultima. Now, shorter words aren't necessarily going to have all 3 of those syllables. The 2-syllable word, of course, will only have a penult and an ultima, and a 1-syllable word will only have an ultima. The next thing we need to look at that's going to be important for talking about accents are the length of the vowels. If you remember in Lesson 1, we talked about this a little bit. Epsilon and omicron are always short vowels, and eta and iota are always long. Then we have diphthongs, which are always long except for omicron iota and alpha iota, and those only when they occur at the very end of the word, in which case they're short. If they have any letters after them, like a sigma or any other letter, then they're still going to be long like a regular diphthong. But oi and I, when they come at the very end of the word, are considered short. And then we have alpha, iota, and upsilon, and they can be short or long, and it just depends, and we'll let you know when that's important for you to know whether they're short or long. Sometimes the accents themselves will tell you. A long vowel makes the syllable long, and a short vowel makes the syllable short. So when we talk about short syllables and long syllables, we're talking basically about the vowels that are in those syllables, which make those syllables short or long. Now we're going to look and see the effect that vowel length has on accents. So first we're going to look at the ultima, because the length of the vowel in the ultima, in other words, the length of the ultima, is going to change where the accent can occur in a Greek word. Let's look first at some English words, because they show us that accents change with word length even in English. We have a word like analog, where the accent is on the first syllable in this word, and if we use our new terminology, that's the antepenult. But when we lengthen the word, it becomes analogy, and now the accent is on a different syllable. Then we have analogical, and the accent's moved again, and analogically, and again the accent there is on the O. So we see that even in English, accents can change with word length or with word changes. In Greek, the default accent is the acute accent, and if the ultima is short, the acute accent can occur on any of the last three syllables. In a word like Makarios, we see the accent on the antepenult. Ka is the antepenult, Ri is the penult, and Os is the ultima. In the word logos, the accent is on the penult, and we see here we have a two-syllable word, and so we don't have an antepenult in this word, we just have the penult and the ultima. And then in eulogetos, we have the accent on the ultima, on the very last syllable. So the acute accent with a short ultima can occur on any of those three syllables. The circumflex accent, however, can only occur on one of the last two syllables, and when the ultima is short and the accent is on a long penult, then the accent won't be acute, it will be circumflex, and that's one of the circumflex rules that we need to learn. Now, let's talk a minute about writing the circumflex accent. Generally, you'll see it as a smooth curve, sort of like a frown over top of the vowel, but Times New Roman font uses this curvy circumflex, so you'll have to get used to seeing it both ways. Now, as I said, the circumflex accent can only occur on the last two syllables, and when the ultima is short and the penult is long and accented, then the accent will be a circumflex accent. So with dikaios, dikaios has a short ultima because of the omicron. Remember that omicron is always short. And the acute accent is on the antepenult, which is fine. With a short ultima, it's fine for an acute accent to be on the antepenult. But protos has a short ultima, but since the penult is accented and long, omega, remember, is always long, then the accent is not acute, it's circumflex. Babylonos also has a short ultima and a long accented penult, so the accent is circumflex. Now let's look at the long ultima and the acute accent. A long ultima changes things. If the ultima is long, then the antepenult can't be accented. So with a long ultima, the acute accent can only occur on the penult or the ultima. So the long ultima reduces the number of syllables which can be accented from 3, which was the ultima, the penult, and the antepenult, to now 2, just the ultima or the penult. So anthropos has a short ultima, and the accented antepenult is fine. Here an is the antepenult, pro is the penult, and pos is the ultima. So we have a short ultima, and the acute accent on the antepenult is fine. But when the word changes and becomes anthropon, now the ultima has changed to long. The omega makes it a long ultima, and so therefore the acute accent can no longer be on the ultima, and now it occurs on the accent can no longer be on the antepenult, so now it occurs on the penult. Now you see an accented penult, and you might be tempted to make it a circumflex accent because of what we said before, but the rule is that when the ultima is short and the penult is long and accented, the accent becomes circumflex. And here the ultima is long, so the acute accent on the penult is fine. Ginosketo now has a long ultima, and the accent is on the penult, and with a long ultima, the accent can't occur on the antepenult. Now what about a long ultima and a circumflex? The rule here is that if the ultima is long, then a circumflex accent can't occur anywhere else. So dikaios, that's a long ultima, we have the diphthong, and that makes the ultima long, and so the acute accent goes on the penult, and that's fine. Theois, however, has a long ultima, and now it has a circumflex on the ultima. And the circumflex with a long ultima couldn't be on the epsilon. The only place the circumflex could occur is on the ultima, and that's where it is. And then agathopoion, here we again have a circumflex accent on a long ultima. which is fine. So we've seen that in Greek, the endings of words change to indicate the role of the word in the sentence. So when the ending changes, sometimes the length of the syllable or of the ultima changes, and that's going to have an effect on what can happen with the accent. So let's look at an illustration of that. We have the word eschatos, which we saw at the very beginning of this lesson, and again it has 3 syllables. Es is the antepenult, cha is the penult, and tos is the ultima. And here we have a short ultima because of the omicron, and because it's a short ultima, the accent can occur on any of the last 3 syllables. And so there it is on the antepenult, and that's fine. But when the ultima changes to an eta, eta you'll remember is a long vowel. So now we have a long ultima, and with a long ultima, the accent can't occur on the antepenult. It can only occur on the penult or the ultima, and here it occurs on the penult, and so you see that the accent has changed from an accent on the epsilon or the antepenult to an accent on the alpha or the penult. So let's look at an example. A word like dikaioi. Now dikaioi ends with a short ultima. It does have a diphthong at the end, but this is one of those exceptions. The omicron iota, the oi sound, when it occurs at the very end of the word with no letters after it, remember then that's one of the exceptions. It's a diphthong that's short. Notice too that this word has 3 syllables even though it has 5 vowels. That's because alpha iota is a diphthong, and as I said, omicron iota is a diphthong. So we have the iota and 2 diphthongs, which gives us our 3 syllables, dikaioi. The ultima then here is short because of the oi at the very end of the word. And so with a short ultima, the accent can occur on any of the last 3 syllables, and here it occurs on the antepenult, and so that works, that's fine, the acute accent stays there. It's an acute because there's no reason to change it to anything different. Dikai is basically the same thing. The ending has changed from oi to I, but I is the other diphthong that's short when it occurs at the very end of the word, and so the acute accent on the antepenult is also fine. But when the word changes to dikaiois, now the ultima has changed as well. We still have the omicron iota, which is a diphthong, but with the sigma at the end, it now acts like a normal diphthong and it's long, so we have a long ultima. With a long ultima, the accent can't occur on the antepenult. It can only be on the penult or the ultima, and here it's on the penult. Notice that we put it with a diphthong, we put the accent on the second vowel of the diphthong, so the accent goes on the iota rather than the alpha. Now we've talked about rules of accents, but we haven't really talked about where the accent goes to begin with. We've talked about rules that tell us where accents can't go, but that still leaves a lot of possibilities. Well, the rules for where accents can and can't go are different for verbs and for nominals. In verbs, the accent wants to go as far towards the beginning of the word as possible, and that's called recessive. So with this first word, ginoske, we have 3 syllables. We have the iota is the first syllable, or the antepenult here. The omega is the penult, and it's long because omegas are always long. And the epsilon there is part of the last syllable, the ultima, and it's short. So since the ultima is short, the accent can go on the antepenult, and the acute accent is the default, and there's no reason to change it. And it's now, the accent you see is on the syllable that's as close to the beginning of the word as possible. Now if the word changes to ginoskes, now we have a long ultima because of the diphthong in that last syllable. So now with a long ultima, the accent can't be on the antepenult, and the penult is as far to the left as it can go, and so that's where it goes because this is a verb. And verbs are recessive, and the accent wants to go as close to the beginning of the word as possible. In ginosketo, now we've added another syllable. The ultima is long because of the omega, and so the accent can only go on the penult or the ultima, and again, because it's a verb, the accent wants to be as close to the beginning of the word as possible, and so as close to the beginning of the word as it can get is here only as far as the penult. It can't go on the omega because that would be the antepenult, and with a long ultima, the accent can't go that far to the left. With the word lue, we only have 2 syllables. The ultima is short, so the accent could technically go on the antepenult, but there isn't one for this word. There's only 2 syllables. So the accent goes as far to the left as it can, which here is to the penult. Now the upsilon here is long, which you wouldn't necessarily know, except that I'm telling you. So we have a long accent in penult with a short ultima, and that means that the accent has to be circumflex. In the second example, luete, we have 3 syllables, so we've added a syllable. The short ultima means that the accent can be on the antepenult, and this time there is one. So we have an acute accent on the upsilon, the antepenult. And with luete-san, we have 4 syllables. The short ultima, again because of the alpha there at the end, means the accent can be on the antepenult, which this time is the epsilon. So in verbs, the accent always wants to be as far to the left as it can go, but which specific syllable is accented sometimes depends on the length of the word, and it always depends on the length of the ultima. With nominals, though, the accent is persistent. Now you'll remember that nominals are nouns, pronouns, adjectives, and articles. So in those words, the accent has one vowel that it likes, and it wants to stay there. Each word is going to be different, and to find out which syllable or which vowel that particular nominal likes to have accent, you're going to look it up in the lexicon or in the dictionary, and that will tell you. With kurios, the accent likes to stay on the upsilon, and in this first example there are 3 syllables. Even though the iota and the omicron occur together, they're not one of the diphthongs, so they form separate syllables. The ultima is short, the us there, so the accent can stay on the upsilon, which is the antepenult. Now when the word changes, again here there are 3 syllables, kuriet. The last syllable is short because epsilon is always short, so the accent can stay on the upsilon, which again is the antepenult. With kurios, however, the situation changes. Omicron iota is a diphthong, and although it can sometimes be short, here it doesn't occur at the very end of the word, so it's long as a usual diphthong would be. But because the ultima is now long, the accent can't be on the antepenult, so it gets pulled to the penult, which in this case is the iota. Let's look at another. If you look theos up in the lexicon, you'll see that the accent prefers to stay on the omicron, which is the ultima. So with theos and the, the ultima is short, and the accent stays, an acute accent on the ultima. Even though the vowel of the ultima has changed, the accent still stays on the ultima. But in these last 2 examples, the ultima is long. Now the accent is going to stay there, but now it's circumflex. Now we don't have a rule that we've learned at this point to explain the change, but at least we know it doesn't violate any of the rules we know. The 3 circumflex accents rules that you do need to know are that circumflex accents can only occur on the last 2 syllables. If the ultima is long, a circumflex accent can't occur anywhere else, so you see that theois and theo doesn't violate that rule. The ultima is long, and the circumflex accent doesn't occur anywhere else. If the ultima is short and the penult is long and accented, then the accent will be a circumflex. So here's the process that we use in determining the accent on a word. First, you determine what syllable gets the accent, and you do that by checking to see whether it's a verb or a nominal. If it's a nominal, you look in the dictionary and find out which syllable usually gets the accent, and you check and see if, and we'll see that in a minute, you check and see if that accent can stay there. And with a verb, you just recognize that the accent is going to want to go as close to the beginning of the word as possible. And then, once you figure out which syllable gets the accent, you determine which accent it gets. So you'll remember that verb accents then are recessive, and noun accents are persistent. In other words, verb accents want to be close to the beginning of the word, and noun accents have a certain spot where they like to be, and they want to stay there. Now, as far as which accent it gets, once you figure out which syllable is accented, the acute accent is the default. So if there's no other reason to change it, it's going to be an acute accent. If you have a long ultima, the circumflex accent can't be anywhere else. If you have a short ultima, a long accented penult gets the circumflex. Now, we haven't talked about grave accents. We will do that in just a minute. But first, let's look at these rules in chart. Sometimes this is helpful if each of those three boxes represents one of the syllables. So the first column on the left is the antepenult, the middle column is the penult, and the last column is the ultima. With a short ultima, you get that first box where an acute accent can occur on any of the last three syllables. A circumflex accent occurs only on the antepenult only on the penult if it's accented and long, and we'll see that a grave accent can only occur on the ultima, on the last syllable. If, however, the ultima is long, an acute accent can only occur on the penult or the ultima, either of the last two syllables. A circumflex accent can only occur on the ultima, and again, a grave accent can only occur on the ultima. Grave accents only occur in sentences, so you're never going to have a grave accent on a Greek word that's sitting all by itself. Grave accents happen when a word with an acute accent on the ultima is followed by most other words. When that happens, the acute accent on the ultima switches to grave. Now, the exception is when the next word is an enclitic, and we haven't covered enclitics yet. Enclitics and proclitics will be covered in Lesson 7. They're the two kinds of Greek words that don't have accents, and there is a difference between the two of them, but at this point, all you need to know is that there are two kinds of Greek words that don't have accents, enclitics and proclitics, and if a Greek word with an acute accent on the ultima is followed by an enclitic, that acute accent is not going to change, which is different from most of the time when a Greek word with an acute accent on the ultima is followed by another word. Normally, the acute accent on the ultima changes. So, I'm not sure how much sense that made, but hopefully as we look at these examples, that'll all become clear, or at least clearer. So in this first sentence, we're going to see acute accents that don't actually change. T has an acute accent on the ultima, and it is followed by another word, so normally the acute accent on the ultima would change to a grave accent, but in this case, the word that it's followed by is an enclitic, and so it doesn't change. Leges has an acute accent, but it's not on the ultima, it's on the penult, and so it doesn't change. The only time an acute accent changes to a grave accent is when it's on the ultima. Agathon has an acute accent on the ultima, but it's not followed by another word, it's followed by a punctuation mark, and so none of the acute accents in this sentence change. In the second sentence, however, the first word, oudeis, would have an acute accent on the ultima, but it's followed by another word, agathos, which has its own accent and isn't either an enclitic or a proclitic, so the acute accent on oudeis changes to grave. Agathos also would have an acute accent on the ultima, but it's followed by another word. A is a proclitic, not a enclitic, so the acute accent on agathos changes to grave. May also would have an acute accent on the ultima, but it's followed by another word, so it changes to grave. Heis has a circumflex accent, and circumflex accents don't change even when they're on the ultima, besides which in this case heis is followed by a punctuation mark, so it doesn't change to grave. And then we have ho theos. Theos has an acute accent on the ultima, but it's followed by a punctuation mark rather than another word, so it doesn't change. So now we've covered all of the rules you need to know about accent marks. Here are some practice sentences, and I'd suggest that you pause the lecture at this point and see if you can explain all of the accents, and then keep listening, and I'll go ahead and give you the explanation, and you can check and see if you're understanding how this works. In the first sentence, we have pistos ho logos. Pistos is a nominal. Its accent likes the ultima, and there's no reason for it to move. It would be an acute accent, but since it's followed by ho, which is proclitic, it changes to grave. Logos is also a nominal, but its accent likes the omicron. it gets the default acute accent then there on the penult, and it doesn't change. Again, there's two reasons for it not to change. First of all, an accent on the penult never changes to grave, and it's followed by a punctuation mark, so it wouldn't change anyway. In the next sentence, pistos is accented the same way as in the first sentence, and for the same reason. Theos is also a nominative, a nominal, and it likes the accent on the ultima. It stays an acute accent because even though it's on the ultima, it's followed by a punctuation mark. Now in the next sentence, nomos is a nominal. It likes the accent on the first omicron. That's the penult, and the ultima is short, so here there's no reason for it to be anything but an acute accent. Hagios is also a nominal, and it likes its accent on the alpha. The alpha is the antepenult, and the ultima is short, so it stays there, and it stays an acute accent. Kai has an acute accent on the ultima, and here we have a one-syllable word that only has an ultima. It's followed by an article which is proclitic, not enclitic, so it changes to grave. Entele likes its accent on the ultima. Normally it would be an acute accent, but it changes to grave here because it's followed by another word. Hagia, as we've seen, likes its accent on the first alpha. It's a nominal, so the accent wants to stay there. However, the final alpha is long in this word, so the accent can't stay on the antepenult. Now, you wouldn't know that that final alpha is long, except that you can tell because the accent moved, and also because I'm telling you. So it's pulled forward to the penult, and the accent stays acute. The next word is kai, and both this kai and the next kai have grave accents for the same reason. Normally, kai would have an acute accent on its diphthong, which is the only syllable that it has, but it's followed by another word in both cases, and so that acute accent changes to grave. Dikaya is a nominal, which normally would take an accent on the yoda, which is the antepenult, but here the alpha at the end of the word is long, and so the accent can't go on the antepenult, it has to move to the penult, which is where it is, the kai there. The last word in the sentence, agape, it likes its accent on the ultima, and so there it is, on the ultima, which is a long ultima with the eta. It's an acute accent, so it could change to grave, but it's followed by a punctuation mark, not by another word, so it stays acute. The last sentence, hagion to onoma. Hagion likes its nominal again, and it likes its accent on the antepenult, which is the alpha there. The on of the last syllable is short, so it's a short ultima, and the acute accent can stay on the antepenult. To would normally have an acute accent on its antepenult, which is the only syllable there is there, but it's followed by another word, and so the acute accent changes to grave. Onoma is another nominal, and its accent likes the antepenult. It's followed by a punctuation mark, and it's not going to change anyway because it's on the antepenult. But in this case, the alpha is short, and so that's why the acute accent can stay on the antepenult rather than moving to the penult. The ultima is short, so the acute accent on the antepenult is fine.